1,500 Moroccan soldiers, 40,000 defenders. One day in the desert. By sunset, the largest empire in the history of Africa was finished. Its capital was looted, its libraries raided, its scholars dragged in chains across the Sahara. Most people who study history have heard of the Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire, the Ottoman Empire. Almost no one in the West has heard of this one. This is the story of a kingdom that controlled 500,000 square miles. A kingdom that built one of the medieval world's greatest universities. A kingdom that produced scholars whose books are still being read 5 centuries later. A kingdom that vanished almost overnight, partly because of a herd of cattle. I'm Brother Idris, and welcome to the archive, where forgotten history lives again. When the Mali Empire began to crumble in the late 1300s, a new power rose along the Niger River. It was called Songhai. And at its peak, it would dwarf everything that came before it in West Africa. The Songhai people had lived along the great river for centuries before they built an empire. They were fishermen, farmers, traders. Their canoes had carried goods up and down the Niger since the early Middle Ages. But for most of that time, they were a province, first of the Ghana Empire, then of Mali. That changed in the 1400s, when Mali began to weaken from civil wars and dynastic disputes. The Songhai broke away, and then they began to expand. By the early 1500s, the Songhai Empire stretched from the Atlantic coast of modern Senegal to the Hausa cities of northern Nigeria. In the north, it reached deep into the Sahara. In the south, it extended into the forests near the Akan goldfields. It covered roughly 540,000 square miles, an area twice the size of modern France. At its core were 3 cities along the river: Gao, Djenné, and Timbuktu. Gao was the capital, a trade hub for merchants from across the Muslim world. Arab traders from Cairo, Berber caravans from the Maghreb, scholars from Andalusia, all of them came to Gao. Djenné was the gateway to the south, a market town built entirely of mud brick. It contained the largest mud brick mosque on earth, a structure that still stands today, almost 1,000 years later. But Timbuktu was the jewel. It was already legendary by the time Songhai took control of it. Under Songhai's rulers, it would grow into one of the most important centers of learning anywhere in the world. The man who built the Songhai Empire was named Sunni Ali. He came to power in 1464. For the next 28 years, he reshaped West Africa with the sword. Sunni Ali was, by all accounts, a military genius. He fought wars on every front, and he won most of them. He drove the Tuaregs out of Timbuktu, which they had held for 30 years. He fought off attacks from the Mossi kingdoms to the south. He pushed back the Dogon people in the cliffs of Bandiagara. He built a navy on the Niger River, fleets of canoes that could move troops faster than any rival could march. His most famous campaign was the siege of Djenné. The city was protected by a floodplain that turned into a swamp during the rainy season. Sunni Ali camped his army outside the walls and waited for 7 straight years. The chronicles say he kept his troops on station through floods and droughts, refusing to leave until the city ran out of food. When Djenné finally surrendered, he treated the inhabitants well. But other cities he conquered were not so lucky. He was brutal, especially toward the scholars of Timbuktu, whom he distrusted as a competing source of authority. He had many of the city's leading clerics executed, exiled, or imprisoned. He raided their libraries. The chronicles of the period, written of course by those scholars and their descendants, describe him as a tyrant. But the same chronicles also acknowledge that without his conquests, the empire would never have existed at all. He also kept his people's older traditions alongside Islam, making him an outsider in the eyes of the Muslim elite. When he died in 1492, drowning by some accounts while crossing a river, the religious establishment had had enough. His son tried to take the throne. He didn't last a year. A general named Muhammad Toure marched against the new king, claiming he wasn't a faithful Muslim. In April of 1493, the two armies met at the Battle of Anfao. Muhammad Toure won. He took the throne under a new title, Askia. He would later be known as Askia the Great. If Sunni Ali built Songhai with conquest, Askia built it with bureaucracy. He centralized the empire from his court in Gao. He created ministers of finance, of agriculture, of justice. He standardized weights and measures across his territory, a small detail that revolutionized trade. He ran his courts on Islamic law, but allowed traditional religion in the countryside, where most of his people lived. He tripled the size of the empire, adding the Hausa city-states to the east and former Mali territories to the west. By the early 1500s, the Mansa of Mali, the ruler of the empire that had once dominated West Africa, was paying tribute to Askia. He could send representatives to the courts of Cairo and Marrakesh as an equal. He exchanged ambassadors with Muslim Spain. But his greatest legacy wasn't the conquests. It was Timbuktu. Askia restored what Sunni Ali had broken. He invited the scholars back to the city. He built mosques, libraries, observatories. He paid scholars from Egypt, Morocco, and Andalusia to come and teach. He turned Sankore, already a major mosque, into the heart of a vast academic network. In Timbuktu, scholars taught law, theology, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, history, grammar, and rhetoric. While most of Europe was still struggling out of the Middle Ages, scholars in Timbuktu were calculating the orbits of stars. They wrote treatises on surgery, on pharmacology, on the geometry of celestial spheres. They debated the legal status of merchants, the ethics of slavery, the nature of evidence in a courtroom. The teaching was not centralized like a European university. There was no single institution. Instead, individual scholars taught their own students, sometimes in mosques, sometimes in their own homes. The most prestigious teachers had hundreds of students at a time and waiting lists that stretched for years. Salt remained the primary currency for foreign trade. Gold flowed north across the desert. Books flowed south on the backs of camels. Manuscripts were copied by hand in elegant scripts on paper imported from as far away as Italy. It was said in Timbuktu that a good book cost more than a slab of pure gold. A scholar's library was his most valuable possession, far more valuable than houses, livestock, or land. When a scholar died, his books were inherited like treasure. Some family libraries grew over generations to thousands of volumes. By the time Askia died, around 1538, Songhai was the largest empire in the history of West Africa. It would not survive his great-grandsons. The trouble began far away, across the Sahara in Morocco. In 1578, the Saadian Sultan of Morocco, Ahmad al-Mansur, won a stunning victory against an invading Portuguese army. The Battle of Alcácer Quibir destroyed 3 Portuguese kings in a single day. It was one of the most decisive battles of the 16th century. But the cost of the fortifications and mercenaries that won that victory had bankrupted Morocco. Al-Mansur needed gold, a lot of it. He looked south across the desert and saw what he believed was the answer, the Songhai Empire. Al-Mansur was convinced, wrongly, that Songhai's wealth came from gold mines inside its territory. His advisors warned him that attacking another Muslim nation was unlawful. He didn't care. He sent letters demanding tribute from the Songhai Emperor. The emperor refused. In October of 1590, Al-Mansur dispatched an army across the Sahara. It was small, but it was lethal. just 4,000 men, 1,500 light cavalry, 2,500 infantry, almost all of them armed with arquebuses, an early form of musket, plus 8 cannons, and a supply train of 8,000 camels, 1,000 pack horses, and 600 laborers to carry it all through the desert. The commander was a man named Judar Pasha, a Spanish boy who had been captured as a child and raised in the Moroccan court. He had risen through the ranks by a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and absolute loyalty to the Sultan. The march took 4 months. They crossed 1,200 miles of open desert in the dead of winter. They lost soldiers to thirst, to heat, to exhaustion. By some accounts, they lost as many as half their men. But when they finally emerged from the dunes near the Niger River, they were a fighting force the Songhai had never imagined possible. Songhai's emperor at the time was Askia II. He was new to the throne. He had ruled for less than 2 years. He had come to power after a brutal succession dispute, and his hold on the throne was shaky. His provincial governors were rebellious. When word reached him that a small Moroccan army had somehow crossed the Sahara, he gathered his forces. His army was vast, at least 40,000 men by the most conservative estimates. Some sources put the number at 80,000. Cavalry in chainmail, infantry with bows and spears, drummers and trumpeters, war priests carrying amulets. It was an army built on tradition, the same kind of army that had won every major battle in West Africa for 200 years. The two armies met on March 13, 1591, at a small village called Tondibi, just north of Gal. The Songhai outnumbered the Moroccans 10-1, but they had no firearms, none at all. Askia Ishak knew this would be a problem. Word of muskets and cannons had reached him through traders, so he tried something creative. He drove a herd of 1,000 cattle in front of his army. The plan was simple. The cattle would take the first volley of musket fire. Behind them, his infantry would charge under cover of dust and chaos. It was a clever idea, on paper. When the battle began, the cattle started moving forward toward the Moroccan lines. Then the Moroccans fired their cannons. The cattle had never heard cannon fire before. They panicked. They turned around, and they trampled directly back through the Songhai infantry behind them. The Songhai lines collapsed in chaos before the battle had even properly started. What followed was, in the words of the local chronicle Tarikh al-Sudan, a defeat in the twinkling of an eye. The Songhai soldiers who hadn't been trampled were cut down by arquebus volleys at point-blank range. Their cavalry charged. It was repulsed by disciplined musket fire. Their rear guard tried to make a final stand. It was destroyed. By sunset on March 13th, the largest empire in Africa's history was finished as a great power. Askia Ishak fled south with the remnants of his army. He would die in exile a year later, betrayed by his own brother. Judar Pasha marched on Gal. He found it abandoned. The royal court had fled. He sacked the city anyway. Then he marched on Timbuktu, then on Janneh. The Moroccans expected to find gold mines. They found none. Songhai's wealth had come from controlling the trade routes, not from owning the gold itself. Al-Mansur was furious. He sent reinforcements and new commanders. He ordered the systematic looting of every Songhai city. The Moroccan occupation dragged on for years, then for decades. But Songhai's golden age was over. In 1593, the scholars of Timbuktu rose in revolt against the occupation. The Moroccans crushed them. The most famous scholar in the city was a man named Ahmed Baba. He was 37 years old at the time. He had been writing books since his early 20s, on law, on biography, on the rights of merchants, on the ethics of the slave trade. When the Moroccans came for him, he refused to bow. He was deported in chains to Marrakesh, along with his entire extended family. The Moroccans confiscated his personal library, 1,600 books. He called it the smallest library of any of my friends. Think about that for a moment. 1,600 books in a single private collection. And his friends had larger ones. Ahmed Baba spent 14 years in exile in Morocco. He was held in Marrakesh, forced to teach in the Sultan's court. He kept writing. By the end of his life, he had produced more than 40 books on subjects ranging from law to grammar to history. He was finally allowed to return to Timbuktu in 1607, after the death of al-Mansur. He died in his hometown in 1627, surrounded by his students. But the city he came back to was a shadow of what it had been. Most of Timbuktu's other scholars had been killed, exiled, or had simply fled. The libraries had been raided. The trade routes had been disrupted. The students had stopped coming. The Songhai people themselves retreated south to a region called Dendi. There they would maintain a much smaller kingdom for another 2.5 centuries. But the empire, the great empire that ran from the Atlantic to Nigeria, was gone forever. What survived, against all odds, was the books. Hidden in family homes, buried in clay jars in the desert, passed down quietly from generation to generation. For 400 years, the manuscripts of Timbuktu sat in private collections, mostly forgotten by the outside world. Then, in 2012, armed militant groups overran northern Mali and reached Timbuktu. The militants declared that the city's manuscripts were heretical. They began burning them. But the families of Timbuktu had been hiding their books from invaders for 4 centuries. They did it again. Some manuscripts were buried in the desert. Others were smuggled out in old refrigerators and metal trunks. A few were transported by boat down the Niger River, hidden under sacks of vegetables, to the safe city of Bamako. When the militants were finally driven out, hundreds of thousands of manuscripts have been saved. Today, the Ahmed Baba Institute in Timbuktu holds nearly 40,000 of those manuscripts. The total number scattered through the city's private libraries is estimated at up to 700,000. The oldest dates back to the 11th century. They are written in Arabic, in local African languages, in scripts that no one alive today fully understands. 5 centuries after the Songhai Empire fell, the words written by its scholars are still being read. I'm Brother Idris, and the archive remains open.